Welcome to This Week in Hearing. Hi, I'm Bob Traynor, your host for this episode, and I'm back with my good friend Renée Lefrançois, audiologist at SHOEBOX Limited. And the interesting thing that I have to bring to you today is that we're going to discuss a state-of-the-art tele-audiology platform that SHOEBOX is bringing into the marketplace. Renée, thanks so much for being with us today to discuss this interesting innovation in telehealth and or tele-audiology programs.
Thanks for having me, Bob. I look forward to another discussion and certainly really looking forward to helping push the envelope in terms of innovative clinical solutions.
Well, before we begin, for those who didn't see our last discussion 3 months ago or so, could you refresh us on your journey to SHOEBOX and your position within the company?
I'd be happy to. I'm a clinical audiologist licensed in Ontario, Canada. I've been practicing for 23 years. The first 15 years of my career were spent concentrating on cochlear implantation, which was, fascinating and still is, but certainly really living and breathing innovation. When we started in implantation, we were programming with MS-DOS using F1 and F7. And on the little ones, that was quite the challenge in itself. But here we are. I joined SHOEBOX in 2014, so I've been with them coming up on 9 years. I was employee number 8 and the first audiologist to join the team. We are now over 100 full-time employees, and I manage a team of 12 audiologists in our various branches of audiology and audiometry.
Wow. Well, tele-audiology, telehealth, whichever term you're using this week, but since we're in audiology treatment modes here in this discussion, it's a really hot topic, and particularly for those clinicians who didn't get that much experience with it during the pandemic. Can you give us an overview of what teleaudiology is and how it kind of differs from the traditional practice of the profession?
Happy to do so. So teleaudiology, telehealth actually represents a broad spectrum of different clinical practice scenarios. So you can actually be in the same clinic as a patient. And if you are not face-to-face with that patient, if for whatever reason you are in a different room and on the phone with them or on a video meeting, that is actually considered telehealth. Now, if we go to the other extreme, obviously you can be on different continents of your patient and be meeting with them via phone or video conference, and that also represents telehealth or teleaudiology. Now, different environments and clinical scenarios have different requirements and different benefits to being able to provide care remotely. Top of mind for all clinicians is, of course, the clinical validity, privacy, confidentiality, and effectiveness of the treatment, the assessment that is being provided. Now, we are not alone in the healthcare realm in terms of pushing the envelope there. And COVID, despite being obviously an unfortunate development, did have some positive side effects. And one of them was to accelerate the provisioning of remote services due to not being able to be in the same space as patients, because at the time it was not safe. And so we're taking some of those learnings together with our regulatory bodies and professional standards guidelines to open up new avenues of clinical servicing. Again, having retrospectives on those new offerings is really important to ensure those 3 elements that I mentioned: the clinical validity, privacy, confidentiality, and effectiveness. And so we really want to make sure that that is safe and sound before moving on to the next level. And I believe that that's where we're at right now as an industry.
So what kind of patients are the best suited for teleaudiological treatment?
Great question. As with any new service or product offering, we really want to start with adults And because this is a technological endeavor, adults who are relatively comfortable with either tablets or computers, operating systems, they don't by any means need to be an expert, but someone who is able to potentially troubleshoot or knows where to find the microphone, the speakers on their laptop to be able to facilitate the appointment. Now, we know that there are significant cohorts of people for whom that might not be possible. For example, some of our older adult patients who did not grow up or work with technology as we know it today. And so we've found ways to move forward with providing remote access and remote services, but with additional support. And so I think we'll be going into that in a little more detail, but essentially to start off, working with adults who are comfortable with technology is the right place to start.
So, what are the benefits then to patients? I know, yeah, they don't have to come to the clinic or this, that, but what kind of benefit can people obtain? And which types of patients are they that benefit from this the most?
Certainly patients who are at a far distance from a clinic and understand the effort and cost that it takes to travel hours, 5-10 hours to their local clinic, understand that additional efforts for remote care really benefits them the most. And so the motivation for that group of people is quite high, not to mention the familiarity. We know that hearing is obviously just one small portion of overall human health. And so in remote communities, many individuals have had experience with telehealth, either in video format or telephone format. And so that is the group that I think, is the most immediately motivated to help make this happen. And so also there are certain clinics who have initiated this as part of care, but not total care. So for example, all of the hearing aid fitting and evaluation will be done in person, but perhaps the annual retests and hearing aid check-ins can be done remotely. Is there a type of patient that this is most beneficial for?
Sure.
And I'd like to break that up into 4 groups. One is that people who are just at a significant distance from a clinic or a clinician. 2, those that are immunocompromised. We have people who are on oxygen or who have medical conditions for whom even just seeing the clinician would be putting them at risk, but certainly having them in a waiting room with other individuals would, multiply that factor significantly. Thirdly, are our patients with mobility issues. We know that often there is a ledge to get into a sound booth that is hard for wheelchair and other types of mobility assistance to get over. And so, and often these patients may need to have special transportation to and from the clinic. And so those are patients that would be good candidates as well for remote care. But, and as I mentioned at the beginning, a complement to existing appointments, right? If the point of the appointment is really just to confirm that nothing has changed and just to check in with the patient, that's where having them travel and come into the clinic when there's no suspicion of changes might be a little bit of overkill. So in terms of, success stories, really, we've had a lot of success, not only with returning patients, but even new patients for whom they're coming in for a hearing aid evaluation appointment. SHOEBOX right now is offering all of the tests that I mentioned earlier, which feed into right up to the hearing and noise test, for which we use several different options, but that is a key part right now for hearing evaluations to see, if the individual is struggling in noise. And so knowing that you can do that remotely really helps tie up that appointment nicely. So those would be 2 use cases that I think are really good for this type of service delivery. Cases which might not be as good of a fit are those, for example, patients in ENT clinics who are surgical candidates, often because they require pretty extensive masking and as well as visual inspection, et cetera, or patients requiring debridement.
Well, I know you said something about, yeah, we're going to start with adults and things like that, but can you use this with pediatric patients at all?
Yes, you can. Although
That's good.
obviously, yes, that is good. And actually, speaking back to my past area of concentration being cochlear implants, this was something that we were really putting a lot of effort into, even in the mid 2000s. I know that in Canada, we have a very large geographic space. We had patients that were flying in from, a 6-hour flight from, close to the North Pole. And so, they were originally coming down once a month, and we were able, with telehealth and teleaudiology, to be able to reduce that to once every 3 months, as long as everything was going well. But it is really important to say that there are really 3 different models of remote care. One is that the patient is pretty much fully independent. And so they can be either in their home or in a medical clinic where they are the ones that are, handling the computer or the iPad for the most part. The second model is when there is an assistant present. So that assistant could either be in the clinic, or that assistant could travel to the patient's home to assist them with the computer setup, any internet connectivity issues, ambient noise challenges. And the third model is when an actual hearing healthcare professional is present there with a patient. So that can be an audiology assistant. It can be an auditory verbal therapist. It could be an audiologist or a hearing instrument specialist. And so for children, we would really be relying on the last model that I mentioned, and ensuring that they had the clinical support that was appropriate for their developmental age.
So that's kind of how the remote process of hearing assessments work. Now, can you tell us a little more about some of the specifics relative to the remote hearing assessment?
Yes. One of the key issues that needs to be measured, documented, and considered is ambient noise monitoring. We know that very few people, if any, have a soundproof booth in their home. But thankfully, in parallel fashion, we are looking at exploring this, and we have been for about the past 5 years, in terms of what can clinically be done in an accurate way outside of a sound booth. And with the ANSI and ISO standards, they have clearly outlined what is considered an acceptable environment for hearing testing. SHOEBOX has incorporated those values into our product so that it's relatively seamless for whether it be the patient, the assistant, or the associate hearing instrument practitioner to be able to ascertain whether or not the environment is suitable. We use an external class 2 microphone to take those measurements on a frequency octave band basis. And we found through validation studies that the clinical data is very, very much on par with what you would see in a sound booth with a manual test with an audiologist.
Wow. That's something we never thought would be ever something that would work. All of the remote tests and all of the this and that have always been, well, you just can't get it quite correct. And it sounds like you guys have figured out a system that will do that. Of course, technology advances, and we're able to do some of those kinds of things. Can you tell us more about the specific tests that we can perform via teleaudiology? And are there any limitations and challenges with these specific assessments that you guys are going to offer into the market?
With pleasure. So air conduction audiometry, so whether that be pure tone, speech reception thresholds, or speech discrimination testing, is relatively easy to obtain in most quiet environments. And that's because the ears are covered. And thankfully, we, working alongside our audiometric headset manufacturers, we use the Radio-Ear DD450 headset that has the best attenuation of current circumoral audiometric headsets. Inserts do provide better attenuation in the lower frequencies. But of course, we know that inserts require otoscopy and a hearing healthcare professional to do the insertion. And so with the circumoral headphones, we're opening it up to less risk and less potential error by visualizing the patient putting the headset on themselves and doing a visual check. Now, when we proceed into bone conduction, things shift. And that's because typically bone conduction is done with ears uncovered, especially unmasked bone. However, because the maximum permissible ambient noise levels, also known as M panels, are significantly lower, understandably, when your ears are uncovered, it is next to impossible to, especially at 500 hertz, to meet the maximum noise level in a non-double-walled sound booth scenario. So how the team at SHOEBOX decided to move forward with this after quite a few different trials was we moved back to forehead placement for the bone conductor, and that enabled us to keep the circumoral headphones in place. Now, which basically elevates the M panels to the same level that we would be using for air conduction audiometry. Now, there are a few caveats there. It does take more power to reach the cochleas. So the calibration is different for the bone conductor, whether it's placed on the mastoid or placed on the forehead. In our product, you can actually have both calibrations and select based on your use case which you're going to use. Now, if you are using inserts with that third model I mentioned with a hearing healthcare professional present, then you can use inserts. And if you use inserts, then mastoid placement is completely acceptable and feasible for most people. It's just with the big circumoral headsets, it's very hard to have the bone conductor on the mastoid without touching anything. So of course, we needed to take into account the occlusion effect, which we know is slightly different for adults and kids. And so we factored that into our calculations. You asked if there are some tests that can't be done remotely. Well, yes. Now, right now, our SHOEBOX products offer video otoscopy, which is something that my team and I were very skeptical about. We remember when we were taught, the bridging technique for otoscopy, the risk, and self-otoscopy just seemed a little too far-fetched. But what we did do is it was thanks to the team in France, the original team that created the laptop product that said, we've had some good experience. Why don't you try it? So we took a collection of 7 hearing healthcare professionals, a mix of audiologists and hearing instrument specialists, half of them internal to SHOEBOX, half of them external, and we tested 100 patients. And we're proud to say that of those 100 patients, we were able to obtain usable and clear otoscopy images on 100% of the 100 patients. Now,
wow.
Granted, sometimes it took 15 seconds and sometimes it took 4 minutes, depending on the complexity of the ear canal, the cerumen situation. But knowing that we can factor that into the time of the appointment and having those images saved for either referral or future consideration if there are changes is really a star element of this product.
Great. Now, my guess is that you will, since a lot of people haven't done forehead bone conduction in quite a long time. They may still do it in some components of the profession, but the average practitioner likely hasn't done forehead bone conduction in quite a long time. So that may require a little bit of extra study on their part as to how to interpret all those data. My guess is that you guys will probably provide some help with that component, knowing that that's an issue.
You're absolutely correct, Bob. So we actually have several guides that were written for clinicians to help just bring front of mind some of the considerations when they are deviating a bit from the typical clinical testing that we've all been quite used to. And so you can count on the SHOEBOX clinical team to be able to provide that documentation, some explanations if further explanations are required in terms of how those calculations are applied, as well as how to ensure you're appropriately using the right calibration and being able to move between one and the other.
So that's an interesting idea. Now, have you can you get the same kind of personal care with a teleaudiology appointment as you do with a in-person kind of a situation in a clinic?
I always say, in an ideal world, every patient would be seen by a highly trained hearing healthcare professional in a double-walled sound booth with all the time in the world to do all the tests that would be relevant to that case. So I would not, I would be remiss if I would say that any other service delivery model would, be equivalent to that. However, we know that this is not possible. And I pride myself on my connection with patients and reading patients and adapting my vocabulary, my speed of speech, my body language in accordance to my patient's comfort level, linguistic level, etc. I was very concerned going into this teleaudiology trial of 100 patients that would be lacking. And I was thinking, how am I going to gather the information that I need to be the best clinician that I want to be for that patient? And I have to give the developers credit. Now, there's a lot going in. There's a software division called UX and UI, user experience and user interface, in which a lot of research is done to say, like, what size of image on the screen is best? Too big can make people feel watched. Too small can make it not as accessible for people with vision issues, etc. And so what they've done is in the instructional phase or otoscopy or case history is just like you and I are speaking now, we're at equal visibility. It's as close as can be as to sitting beside each other. But when the testing occurs, we don't want the audiologist to be the same size on the screen. And so what we do is we minimize that, but always having that point of reference on screen so that you can see whether or not your patient is showing signs of discomfort, signs of confusion. And we actually did poll our patients after the 100 teleaudiology sessions to say, did you feel that you established a good rapport with your clinician? And do you feel that it would have been much better in person? Of course, those results were somewhat mixed, but an overwhelming majority were satisfied with the amount of personal interaction that they did have with the clinician. And as I said, I need to credit the software platform to do that, because if we didn't have those nice, clear images, we wouldn't be able to achieve it.
It's always interesting to say, in an ideal world, you would always want to have the best of everything for everybody that walks in the clinic or would be online or however. I think a lot of it is if the clinicians feel comfortable interacting online, then the patients are going to feel much more comfortable interacting online, and how they interact and so on can be a real factor. So have you seen some real success stories with this system so far?
Indeed, we have. And so the service provision that is currently set up for SHOEBOX, sometimes that can include a laptop or using the patient's laptop. And the series of tests that we would perform would be case history, otoscopy, pure tone audiometry, bone conduction audiometry, speech testing, and then speech and noise testing. So those of you who are listening closely will notice that there were some things missing there. One thing is tympanometry. And tympanometry can be done remotely with a tympanomic screener. However, that is a separate part. That is not part of the laptop system that SHOEBOX offers, but we are working with manufacturers to complement the laptop with a handheld tympanometer. Also, reflex testing. IPSI reflexes are relatively easy to do with a portable tympanometer. Contra reflexes less so. So I can't sit here and say it's impossible, but it's not something that we've started looking at yet, but we certainly hope that others are. And then, of course, hearing aid fitting and verification. I would imagine that the hearing aid companies are working on providing some of this, these services remotely. But right now, SHOEBOX focuses mainly on diagnostics.
Okay. Well, and that's a major factor as you're beginning to look at things, and as clinicians and clinics begin to expand their market areas from just the city in which they reside or the county in which they reside to other parts of the world, and as the licensure issues become more minimal rather than in the forefront in some areas, we're going to see more and more of this type of thing, and being able to do the evaluations as part of it really brings people into the clinic. Now, I think that there are some licensing and regulatory issues that go along with the tele-audiology, telehealth programs, and I think the construct is part of that here in the U.S. So how do you guys see that affecting your system?
Well, we have seen quite a bit of progress on that front, even before COVID. I'd like to call out, I believe the state of Louisiana was one of the first ones that had a tele-audiology license designed for people who were out of state, where they went through, a shorter licensing process. And of course, the cost was less than it would be to be practicing in person. But we're seeing more and more states come on board with that. We also have the interstate compact agreement.
That's what I mean. Compact,
yeah, that's
not construct, whatever it was. I knew it was there, and I've heard colleagues like Amin Amlani and others that talk about that relatively often. So I apologize for the wrong terminology there.
No problem. Actually, Bob, not a lot of clinicians have heard of compact. Those for whom it's impactful in their practice would be on top of things. But it's been in the works now, I believe, at least 3 to 4 years. Yeah. And more states are coming on board. Of course, there's different, factors to consider when the requirements for licensure are different between states. But it is moving in the right direction. And again, we're not alone in this. Medicine and healthcare, they're all, just last week online, there was a televised surgery that was being done from Europe to North America remotely. Wow. And so, we're all figuring this out together, but keeping in mind, of course, that patient safety and privacy and efficacy is really the ultimate goal. Convenience is not the goal. And so needing to make sure that we are comfortable with the level of care and the perceived level of care from the patient as we move to expand these service delivery models.
Yeah. And of course, as an audiologist and someone who's been in clinics and around patients and so on, I'm sure you are very concerned about privacy issues and data security and a lot of the things that are really an ethical concern for all of us that are clinicians. So how is that component or that face of the remote care working?
Well, we were able to piggyback on technology in that front, seeing as, the really significant jumps in encryption that we've known in the past 10 to 20 years. We were able to basically cut and paste that from other use cases such as banking and apply this to healthcare. So a SHOEBOX has a portal, but also in terms of its methodology for transmitting video and clinical information is encrypted in such a way that it is deemed to be top of class, and there have been no concerns and no breaches to date. And I think that we look as well to our healthcare and medical partners in terms of lessons learned there and how we can continue to iterate and improve upon it. Although I do have to be fully honest, is that it hasn't been an issue to date. I think that was something that was figured out before we came on board.
Well, Renee, we kind of got off a little bit talking about some of the benefits and then who's going to be the most beneficial patient for this type of a treatment program. So what would you recommend to that seasoned veteran that went through the pandemic and saw patients on telehealth or audiology, and those who are brand new to the concept of telehealth and teletreatment? Now, many AUD programs are now making students study this to some degree, but they still don't have much experience with it. So enlighten us a little bit on what we can do as seasoned veterans and brand new clinicians in teleaudiology.
I'd like to share a bit on my personal experience here. And that is that I believe that good clinicians are not prescriptive in their interactions, but are receptive to patients' differences, situations, and comfort levels. Now, as much as the tests that we're doing are very similar in person as the tests that we're doing remotely, the method of testing and the method of communication is inherently different. And so I would welcome all clinicians, whether they be new grads or experienced clinicians, to take a moment to just reflect on their persona in terms of providing remote care. So, for example, reading the clinician, you don't have the full body image that you would have in a clinic, but you can read a lot from, the shoulders up and facial expressions. Certainly, looking for nods and signs of comprehension, stopping to allow for questions, which you might want to do more often in a remote setting because you don't have all of the same visual cues as you do in person. And also, I would say follow the lead of the person that you are in a session with. There are some individuals that might be more casual. Some prefer being more formal because they're on camera. And I think matching them in terms of that level of communication is really helpful and naturally makes them feel at ease. So, this is something that I think all audiologists excel at in different ways. And so I, basically recommend going back to your roots and thinking, how am I going to build, my ability to read my patients and to provide the best care in this different medium? And I think you'll be pleasantly surprised at some of the tips and tricks that you'll pick up quickly as you start to offer remote care.
We all know patients that when even in the clinic, when you sit down with them and you say, well, you usually work with people who are having some hearing loss, and some will sit there and they will actually talk to you forever just on that stimulus. And others will sit there and say, yes. And then what do you do? So I would encourage our colleagues as they not only work with telehealth and teleaudiology, but also in their face-to-face interactions with patients, to consider personal style. I did an article a year or two ago for Hearing Review on personal style, because there's 4 major personal styles. And if we tune it one to another, that's a lot different than just looking at hearing loss and age of individuals.
Excellent observation and recommendation there.
I remember in my market area, we were in a city, and some of my patients were 150 miles out east of us, and they would come in. And it'd take, you'd spend 10 minutes on the hi, how are you? And then you'd spend 10 minutes on the issue at hand, which could have been anything from minimal wax to a zip kind of a adjustment. And then it's another 10 minutes of a see you later. And then it's another 3 hours for them all the way back home. Right. So I think all of us have seen patients like that over our careers. And this kind of a system it will be a godsend for those individuals, as well as for those that you've mentioned that do have some mobility issues and some compromises and those kinds of things. So thanks so much for being with us today, Renée. And today my guest has been Renée Lefrançois from SHOEBOX Limited. And now it appears that there's a possibility we can do air conduction and bone conduction, speech testing, video otoscopy, and even speech and noise, which gives us a tremendous capability to handle patients remotely. And again, thanks again, Renée, for being with us. Thanks to all of you who tuned in to this episode for being with us today. And please join me next time for another episode of This Week in Hearing.